Back, everybody. Thank you for joining us again for this afternoon's session. Now we are going to have two presentations on ethics, artificial intelligence, and scholarly publishing. We're going to start with Simon Linacre on a new perspective, assessing journals according to SDG relevance. And after that, Randy Townsend, Elizabeth Adams, Chhavi, Chauhan, and Jeff DeCagna on AI ethics. What should publishers be talking about? So we'll start with Simon. Simon is currently marketing director at Cabells, having previously spent 15 years at Emerald Publishing. He is a trustee for COPE and also an ALPSP tutor. He holds master's degrees in philosophy and in international business. I'm going to turn it over now to Simon.
Thank you, John. Thanks to the George Washington University for this opportunity to speak today. I noted that Roger Schonfeld, who most people know is a contributor to the Scholarly Kitchen blog, he noted today that he got a response about a conference paper when they'd said that they'd edited because of the silly use of the Oxford comma, and I'm just realised that I've both used and not used the Oxford comma on my opening slides today, so forgive me for that silliness. But along with the theme of ethics, artificial intelligence, and scholarly publishing, I wanted to talk to you today about assessing journals according to SDG relevance, artificial intelligence, and scholarly publishing. So next slide, please. So firstly, you heard about my background. I work for Cabells. You may or may not know Cabells. It's a US-based company. They are from Texas, and they have been around over 40 years, working in the area of scholarly analytics. So currently, they have a number of products around providing data to researchers and funders and other stakeholders of scholarly publishing around good journals, but also we're the people that do that list the bad journals in our predatory reports database. But today I'm going to talk to you about the good journals and some work that we've been doing with St. Joseph's University, Philadelphia, around some of our journalistics journals that we index. Next slide, please. So the gentleman at the bottom there is Dr. David Steingard from St. Joseph's, and I met him just under 2 years ago at a conference where he was presenting at something that the business school at St. Joseph's, Haub School of Business, have been developing with the Sustainable Development Goals. And what they've been able to do is to assess the curriculum of a business school with regard to which it, if you like, touches the 17 SDGs. So in terms of the research that's done there, the teaching, other things to do with the curriculum. And so when I met him, I kind of, being a journals person, I asked him immediately, well, have you thought about this in terms of assessing how far journals touch the SDGs? And they hadn't. So that started a long conversation that's still ongoing. We met in Davos at the Future of Business Schools Rankings and Ratings events in 2020. And since then, a small team at St. Joseph's and a small team at Cabells have been working to try and understand the extent to which we can assess whether journals' articles are related to the SDGs. Next slide. Now, this is becoming increasingly prevalent in scholarly communications. A number of the big publishers are involved in this, Springer, Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, Emerald, where I used to work. They have been looking at how scholarly research intersects with the SDGs. Now, obviously, one of the reasons is because it's a huge thing. Everybody's broadly, I think, aligned to, or becoming increasingly aligned to, the SDGs. But perhaps more pertinently, from a publishing point of view, there is evidence to suggest that there is more and more funding available for SDG-related projects. And if there is more funding, then in an increasingly open access world, that means there's a better funds available for paying APCs And I think we're seeing the start of a general shift from, if you like, the traditional forms of, or to the traditional subject areas to more SDG related subject areas. Given the high profile, there's the COP26 meeting over here in the UK next month. There's probably never been a better time really to look at how we can see journals through a completely different perspective, and indeed look at it in terms of the different quality measures that we've had in the past to assess the quality or otherwise of a journal. Can we look at it from a completely different perspective and understand with regard to, if you like, how intensive journals articles are related to the SDGs? In other words, the more articles that are related to the SDGs, the greater the impact in terms of that, then, and perhaps a lesser focus on the traditional modes of assessing quality, such as citations. Now, as I said, this is not a necessarily original thought, but it is one that's seems to be coming together with all these other programs that we see here. Next slide, please. So in order to do this, what we wanted to do is to think about, okay, so what within business and management, what are the biggest and best journals? So typically, one of the more popular rankings of this is the Financial Times Top 50. So these are the 50 journals in business and management that the Financial Times uses as a baseline for much of its global MBA rankings. So we took those and we thought, okay, well, in order to kind of prove a point, then we took what we thought would be the most sustainability intensive 50 journals from the Cabells Journalytics database. So we looked at all of the journals and we ran through a few kind of basic searches to get a long list, and then we whittled that down to 50 journals in areas that are related to business and management, but are also have a sustainability focus. And none of these journals are in the Financial Times Top 50. We looked at the output of those 100 journals in total over a 5-year period. And from that 5-year period, we took all of the article titles and abstracts obtained by both manual and automated retrieval. So that gave us a huge, well, a relatively big database of 14 million words. And we then put that through the algorithms in the AI capabilities that St. Joseph's has developed through its assessment of business school curricula. And we went through what's called the iterative refinement. So we put together a group of weightings, ranking the different concepts involved. We used something called sentiment polarity. We used lots of kind of different ways, and we did it iteratively. So we would run it, test it, and then we would kind of look at the results, do some fine tuning, run it again. And through that process, we were able to kind of ascribe a rating. So the rating is related to the extent to which the articles published in that 5-year period in each journal is related to the SDG, the different 17 SDGs. Now, we didn't want, so we've got data, we've got numbers, but we very mindful of the criticisms, for example, of the impact factor and other things. So we didn't want to kind of ascribe a number. We wanted to give a general rating, a general feel for each journal and how related that journal is over that period to the SDGs. But we're also able to capture the top 3 SDGs that the journal's output was related to. And so through all of this, we were able to produce something that we call the SDG impact intensity rating. Next slide, please. So we were able to present this just last month, and actually this is the first time we've had an opportunity to present at a conference, so it's a bit of an exclusive there. And so what we were able to do is we've made freely available on the Cabells. We have a blog site called The Source, so it's freely available as a resource there. The list of those 100 journals with the rating and also with the top 3 SDGs. And we've made that freely available. And we're in a phase now where we're looking to fine tune it again and to kind of almost go back to the drawing board and widen out how many journals we're actually going to look at, because we're thinking of looking at a lot more business and management journals to test this with, but also to engage with people such as people on the call here to get feedback, etc., about the rating. So it's very much a pilot exercise. This is not a product or anything like that, but it may well develop that in the future. Next slide. So just on the right there's a kind of sneak peek of what this actually looks like. So what we found was that of the 100 journals we looked at, the sustainability related journals that we chose occupied 48 of the top 50 places. In other words, only 2 of the FT 50 journals made it into the top 50 when we look at it through an SDG lens. Now, we expected it to be something like that, although perhaps we didn't expect it to be quite that stark, the difference. And what was really interesting is that the journals that did make it to the top, so there are 6 journals there that got the full 5 wheels, as we called it, the 5 wheels, the 5 SDG wheels. They got the full rank, the top rating, because they were the highest sector that we identified as having the most SDG intensive journals, and they were quite varied actually. There was journals on gender and globalization and built environment, more general journals about environment and sustainability, and they were also from a range of journals. So there were big publishers there, but there were also smaller publishers as well. They're certainly not the typical journals when you look at those journals with the highest impact factors or anything like that. And that's what we were kind of moving towards, the kind of the ethical, if you like, element of the AI. What we really wanted to test was this completely different perspective of what is quality research. Is quality research something that's going to get cited lots in the usual journals, or is, when we're in a climate crisis, something completely different, something that has a greater relevance to those goals that have been identified, that are going to help, hopefully, turn things around with regard to the climate and sustainability. Now, as I said, we're looking very much at expanding this to a wider number of business and management journals, and then ultimately potentially expanding it to all the journals that Cabells currently indexes. But that's going to be quite a big task, because currently we have, or certainly soon we will have, over 17,000 journals, which is obviously going to be a bigger enterprise than just the 100 journals. But that's why we're taking this step by step. Next slide. So this is just to show you the starkness of that shift. And we, believe it or not, on earlier iterations of this, there was only 1 journal from the FT50 that made it into the top 50. And there was also the journal that we thought was going to make it, which is perhaps the most famous business ethics journal in management, called the Journal of Business Ethics, that didn't make it into the top half. And I think one of the issues that we found, one of the kind of breakthroughs, if you like, we had, was that the earlier iterations we had, then the problem we were having was that we had to change the AI quite substantially, actually, because the AI, the text in the AI that we were assessing was SDG related text. In other words, it was, I mean, the UN provide a huge amount of textual information about exactly, from the UN perspective, what each of the 17 SDGs covers. That language is not the same as the language used typically by academic researchers when they publish their articles. So academic language with regard to sustainability is different to, for example, the UN or to other agencies when they talk about sustainability. It's quite illustrative of the general principle that has been around a long time about this, the disconnect between what's going on in the real world and what goes on in academia. So what we were able to find is we found a data set of 1,000 words where somebody has actually, if you like, translated that real world text, that real world language, to academic language. So it basically says when academic says this, what they mean in the UN SDG terms is this. And that was a real breakthrough. We were able to, the results that we got once we'd made that change was a much more, had, you know, passed the kind of sense check much more easily. Next slide. So to kind of illustrate this change, the top Wordle there is from the most common words used in the #1 rated journal, and the bottom Wordle there is from the most common words used in the least SDG relevant journal, which is a finance journal. Another kind of AI related issue we had was that the word equity in finance terms obviously has a very specific meaning and quite common use, but in SDG terms, equity has a completely different meaning. And so we had to kind of parse out those types of meanings as well, which is another challenge that the team at St. Joseph's did really well to understand it. So this is kind of where we're at now, where we think we've through the process of all these iterations, we've kind of developed the ability to rate these journals in terms of their like we say, that the word that we think is most applicable is intensity. We think that perhaps conveys the best kind of feeling for what these journals is, and this is what we want to do with this particular metric, is to provide researchers and funders and librarians with a different understanding and a different guide in terms of how journals cover certain topics. And we think this is possibly, this could be used alongside other metrics, maybe alt metrics or something like that, to provide a much more kind of rounded view of the areas that these journals cover. Next slide. So we've already had some buy-in. One of the publishers is somewhere I used to work. So they kind of bought into this and said, okay, well, you know, our journals don't normally get this kind of coverage. They don't normally come at the top of these lists. So they were happy with it. And as I said, we've also had a couple of the other big publishers have been in contact to learn more about it. And maybe they'll be able to help us, because one of the big problems that we did have is getting all the data available. So we were able to do it, but it took a long time, and it was quite labor intensive to do. If publishers were able to give us the information, in other words, the title and abstract information of articles published over the 5-year period, if we were able to be sent that, then that would be a big help. Hopefully more publishers will like what we're doing, and we can collaborate with them in the future. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we are looking at now the next phase, which is looking at 3,000 business and management related journals. As I said, there are going to be problems with that, and so that's kind of the next big challenge of gathering all that data together. St. Joseph's are increasing the number of people available to help us with this, and we're also further developing the algorithm to take into account feedback that we've already had and possibly will have in the future when we do more of these talks. We're also talking to HESI, which is the Higher Education Sustainability Initiative, as well as the United Nations Publishers Compact, which is a list of over 100 publishers and scholarly communications organizations that are broadly signed up to the SDGs and want to help with what the UN is leading on here. And we're very much involved in that conversation as well. Next slide. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. We appreciate that, and we will have time for questions at the end. Right now, we are going to have Randy Townsend, Elizabeth Adams, Chhavi Chauhan, and Jeff DeCagna speaking on AI ethics. What should publishers be talking about? So I'm going to turn it over to Randy. Just one sec.
Great. Thanks, John, and thanks, everybody. Really want to quick introduce my panel. Actually, I'll let them introduce themselves. I'll start with Elizabeth.
Well, first off, thank you, Randy, for the invitation. Excited to be here. I am Elizabeth M. Adams. I'm a Chief AI Ethics Advisor. I work with executives and leadership teams on helping them adopt leadership of responsible AI, which is really a shared leadership function between technical and non-technical employees to begin to operationalize responsible AI. So again, it's super excited to be here.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Chhavi?
Thank you again for the opportunity, Randy. Hi, I'm Chhavi Chauhan. I'm Director of Scientific Outreach and Director of Journal Continuing Medical Education Program at the American Society for Investigative Pathology. I'm also one of the leaders of Women in AI Ethics Collective.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Jeff.
Thanks, Randy. I'm Jeff DeCagna, Executive Advisor for Foresight First in Reston, Virginia. And my usual role is to work with the association on the challenges of the future, and that includes issues around how AI and automation are going to affect their organizations, their professions and industries and fields, with a strong emphasis on considering the ethical issues that go into that. So happy to be here.
Great. Thank you all for joining us today. This is a really exciting time to really discuss how AI ethics intersects with publishing and publishing ethics. So I'm really grateful for you all joining us. One quick question for each of you in 30 seconds or less, if you don't mind. What is your opening provocation about AI and ethics? And I'll start in reverse order. I'll start with you, Jeff, and we'll work our way backwards.
Sure. So my opening provocation is that whenever I see an article anywhere on social media that includes the phrase AI revolutionizes fill in the blank, I get worried because it for a couple of reasons. One, it sort of continues to advance this idea that what we have now with AI is something that is going to fix every problem, address every issue, without actually taking a look at the real problems that exist within the way AI is developed, the way AI is implemented, and the impact of AI on real human beings. So I get a little concerned every time I see that formulation of AI revolutionizes fill in the blank or something like that. That worries me. So that's my sort of opening thought.
Great. Chhavi?
That was very well said, Jeff. I think not to add on to what he said, but to add, say something different. I would say viral spread of misinformation. And that is something that we have sort of dealt with during the pandemic. So it's very fresh and new to each one of us. We have seen a surge in preprint servers as well. Not all information is bad information, but I think there has been a viral dissemination of misinformation in the context of the pandemic, especially. And I think another provocation would be radical polarization by targeted marketing. And I think we can get back to that in a little bit because I had only 30 seconds.
And that's an important point too, Chhavi, because the truth is buried in there, right? The truth is in there, but all the misinformation is on top. You have to figure out what's what. Yeah, we'll get back to that. This is 30 seconds. Elizabeth.
Yeah, so adding to what they were saying, my provocation is basically as we advance further into the fourth industrial revolution, the digital age, I want to live in a society where I can trust AI, the AI-enabled systems that I'm using, that are used by governments, businesses, academia, and society. I really want AI to help us build bridges and help us come together as a society versus further divide us. And I want AI to help us all thrive no matter where we live in the world. So that's my North Star, my provocation.
Yeah, that's great because as Simon illustrated, we become more and more dependent on AI because it makes our lives easier. But at the same time, what is it? At what cost does that ease come with? Jeff and I, you talked about this. You and I talked about this a little bit in the past.
Mm-hmm.
What most concerns you about the state of AI today?
Did you want me to answer, or would you like someone else to go?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to do it because I want to kind of pick up on where Elizabeth started. which is almost 3 years ago, Pew Research Center issued a report that was based on a census of almost 1,000 experts, in which they were asked, on balance, how do you feel will AI be for good or for bad by 2030? And 63% of the participants in that census said they thought it'd be for good, but the 37% number stuck with me. And the number one thing that I took away from that report was what I think we're seeing now, which is kind of chaos sowing that comes with the irresponsible use of artificial intelligence, by bad actors, and the way deep fakes are a problem, and other aspects of that. But just generally, I'm concerned that, a more recent report from Pew Research Center issued in June talks about how a very similar process of canvassing experts suggested that 68%, I believe, of the experts felt that AI would not be designed according to ethical principles, in the public good. And even though those questions were posed were not exactly the same question, it shows a remarkable shift in mindset in less than 3 years from, on balance, it's going to be good, to we're now looking at potentially, the more use of AI in ways that raise real concerns, ethical and other concerns. So I've got serious issues around where we're headed, because an economic agenda is driving the adoption of AI versus, what's in the public interest.
Chhavi, what are your thoughts?
With what Jeff has said so far, and I think another thing that we should all be focusing on, and we haven't really been talking about, is algorithmic accountability, right? Because there are developers who are, generating these algorithms, and they may not fully understand the scope of the output that this algorithm will generate. So I think there is a greater need to include all the stakeholders when the algorithms are even built, and tested, because everyone brings in different perspectives. Anyone who talks about AI talks about the dirty data on which AI is being built. So we know our data sets have been very limiting, and they're not as diverse as we would like them to be. They perform so well, but like Jeff mentioned, there are always these unintended, unforeseen outcomes. So there should be some algorithmic accountability in place. So as these algorithms are scaled up or applied to, other data sets that they were not really trained on, they perform well. And if they fail to do that, then what are the steps that whoever is the organization that is selling that product, what steps are they going to take to circumvent these unforeseen, unintended consequences? And who are the stakeholders who are a part of this algorithmic accountability team, because there should be users who should be a part of this team. There should be developers, data scientists. They should also be the folks who are involved. For example, if you're building something for the editorial processes, then folks from the editorial process workflow who understand how things work and perhaps can provide a little bit more context. So I would go with algorithmic accountability for sure.
And Elizabeth, you've done a lot of research in this area, right?
I have, but I also have lived experience, and work experience and research experience. So I spent 3.5 years working in community here in Minneapolis. And so I saw what happens when our technology worlds and our social worlds collide. And so what concerns me really is how fast AI is outpacing the protections for humans, and that we're quickly moving into more of a surveillance state, and that it's being masked as technological advancements. And one such example is this image of the dancing robot dog, right? So we kind of warmed up to it when we saw it first, and its cuteness and its playfulness and its ability to dance on beat to certain music. And then the next image we saw probably 8 or 9 months later is now that the same robot dog has automatic weapons on top of it. So what concerns me is how we're initially made aware of some of these tools, right, in such a subtle way that it's almost too late when we become alarmed. And the people who are mostly impacted by that are communities of color and vulnerable populations who are not technologists, who are trusting our policymakers and they're trusting these businesses to kind of do the right thing in the absence of regulation. So that's kind of what concerns me.
Great. There's a question in here from the chat, so I'll take that and then I'll jump back into my questions. But how long until AI can write a research paper that is indistinguishable from a paper written by a researcher, and how will that change the framework of research itself? Chhavi, you want to take that one?
I was hoping someone would ask about this, because one of the things that I have been talking about or thinking, when I'm talking at these scholarly publishing events, is that we need to start thinking about AI-generated content that is going to come across to the publishers, to the peer reviewers. So I do not have an answer for this attendee. When will that come into mainstream? But it's already happening in ways where AI is generating content, whether it be writing stories, lyrics, or even singing. But I think there is a need for ethics editorial boards at this point, just like how we have editorial boards and peer review processes in place for human-generated content to vet its relevance. So we need to have individuals from various backgrounds to be a part of this, AI ethics board. And then there would be the question of who's accountable, right? If you see gaps or I think traces of misinformation because the AI might pick that from its environment, then how is that going to be addressed, and who's going to be held accountable for that?
And can I add something?
Sure.
I want to add, and this is just a simple use case. So think about Grammarly. I think that's how you say it, Grammarly.
Mm-hmm.
Where, so there's machine learning and algorithms behind that. And while its intended purpose is to really help you, I'm wondering whose words they're choosing to update my words. Like, how come my words aren't good enough, right? And so I think about that when I think about that tool, because that's one of the tools that is suggested in my doctoral program, is to use that to kind of refine the language. But whose language are we talking about? Am I talking about me writing for scholarly purposes, or for maybe the basic public to understand my writing, just as an example?
Yeah, and you and I talked about that too, Elizabeth, about the different dialects that are out there. So if you speak Creole and you add that into your writing, will these kinds of technologies strip that out because it doesn't conform to what's perceived as normal or regular acceptable language?
Yeah, correct.
And this goes back to something Elizabeth said earlier that connects with what you were mentioning in our conversation, Randy, which is we're using what are seemingly innocuous applications like Grammarly, which I use, right? And I'd say on balance, it probably has certainly improved my email writing. I don't know if it's improved anything else that I write, but it's fairly innocuous. But there are these underlying concerns, and so here we are trading, for convenience, trading some of this privacy, and giving that over, that is being used in ways that we're not able to control, and all the legal frameworks in which we have in the past, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving legal advice, but just generally as an observation, are legal frameworks where there was some sort of implied consent about the use of our words or use of our images. That consent has now been extended, right? To other purposes, to train AI, whether it's through words or images, whether it's on Facebook or through Grammarly. Of course, now we don't see Facebook necessarily as an innocuous application, but one time it was, and so that I think that's the real concern here, is that simple things like robot dogs can very quickly become weapons, and that's something I think we have to be extremely concerned about, given that others are really trying to advance us down this pathway without adequate ethical, legal, and other protections in place.
Yeah.
Can I add something, a comment to that?
Sure.
So, I mean, I'm eternally optimistic, and I'm a strong proponent of using AI for the empowerment of humankind. So I think not all AI is evil, and, we have talked about how it could be bad for us, but I do want to point out an instance. I mean, for our journals, we do use Authenticate. Essentially what that does is, I'm not promoting a product here, but what that particular feature does, it's AI enabled, but it'll scan for, the English language, and it'll give a score to the authors before they can submit their manuscript to us. And it'll also give them a score for the amount of plagiarism, in certain cultures. And I come from one of the other countries that I wasn't trained here. So oftentimes folks use similar language that was published earlier, without paraphrasing. So I think this is an opportunity for folks who are coming from different geographies, who are not aware of certain international standards, or when English is not their first language, improve the content before it can be sent to a peer-reviewed journal. So oftentimes I hear from the reviewers that, this is coming from a particular geography. So, I'm having a hard time reviewing the content. So they're not really reviewing the content for what it's worth, but because of the poor grammar or for poor, articulation of the content, they often don't even give it a chance. So there is scope for AI to enable folks present better research, which can be disseminated. I think there is that element to AI as well.
So building off of that, and I know you're the optimist, I love that. The robots are not going to take over completely. I like that. There's still space for me. In terms of DE&I, diversity, equity, inclusion, and adding accessibility, is AI more helpful in the area of accessibility than it is in other areas of diversity and inclusion? Or do you see it having an equally balanced impact on improving conditions for those that are not necessarily on an even playing field?
I'll take it.
Okay.
I think that there are different ways to define accessibility, and maybe it's for people who have different physical abilities, or we can define accessibility based on people who might live in rural communities, and now that they have access to information that they might not have because now we have internet connection or so forth. But I think with AI, what we're learning, and I like to play in that optimism field as well, because I'm a technologist and I want technology to work. I love technology. I just know that it hasn't worked as well for a lot of people. So I think there are a number of ways that it can work. For instance, there are screen readers that are helping people with different vision abilities read content. But there's also AI ethics issues around exam proctoring. So there are people that have different physical abilities that have been told that they failed certain exams because those systems have not been trained to work with people with different physical abilities. So I think that absolutely AI can help in a number of different ways, right? Advance us into, to whatever it is that we want AI to be. But we also have to be aware that there are these challenges like we've been talking about. And so, yes, I want to play in the space of optimism. I do believe from accessibility perspective that AI can help, as I mentioned, but also we have to just be aware of some of those challenges where it's not working.
Yeah, well, it's not unusual for me to play the more pessimistic role on conversations like this one, and really, I don't want to suggest that I'm doing it for effect, because I'm not really like super pessimistic. Although there are days when that's different. The thing that continues to concern me is I agree with everything that both Elizabeth and Chhavi have said about the beneficial effects of AI, certain applications, NLP, and computer vision, and the value that is creating for real world use cases. But at the same time, I continue to be deeply worried about the fact that we still have applications, even despite all of the awareness that seems to exist now about the ethics issues, about the discrimination, about data sets and the problems with those data sets and issues, lack of diversity, and even in the development of AI algorithms and the issues there. But even with all of the awareness that has been promoted over the course of the last many years, that we still see applications coming out that fail to take into consideration who's being adversely affected. Why are we still permitting certain applications to adopt racist language because they've been trained in a way that enables that to happen. So I continue to have real worries about it. I worry that in the same way that the technological development may be outpacing the legal and ethical architecture for how AI is implemented, the economic imperative is even further accelerating that, because, and we're seeing that because PwC released a survey through, there was an article in Harvard Business Review recently about it, saying that because of the pandemic, companies are accelerating their adoption of AI, in part because people have been working from home or they've lost people. And so they're using AI to fill in the gaps and to address issues of headcount and to, find things like, so we're seeing that happen. And even though that's the corporate sector and we're talking to more of a scholarly academic audience, I don't necessarily see that there may be some differences in the adoption rate, but I think we'll continue to see, how can we, the imperative will be, how can we use AI to address certain issues, and only if the actors involved, the decision makers involved, as Chhavi was saying earlier, come from diverse backgrounds, have diverse perspectives, diverse training, right? Not just technologists, but people with training in sociology and anthropology and ethics and other areas. Will that decision making really take into account how others are affected, instead of just what are the capabilities of these technologies? And we have to remind ourselves that AI is not magic; it's math, and we want to make sure that math is not being used in ways that are, as Elizabeth said earlier, are disadvantaging people of color, communities of color, as unfortunately we have seen historically in so many other aspects of the way our society functions.
Jeff, I think you just took me out of the equation, because you're right, it's math. You're speaking to publishers, and I don't know about the other attendees. Math has never been my strong suit. I can write. There's a question in the chat. Have attempts been made to develop an ethical AI? I think maybe 30 seconds for each of you for that one. You want to start, Elizabeth?
Sure. Are there attempts? Yeah, there are. Well, let me just say this. There's a lot of definitions and a lot of people working on ethical AI. There are frameworks. There's lots of organizations. There's guidance that has come out all across the world. So yes, there is, but there's very little regulation. So while all of these groups are doing great work, the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, UK, the US, South America, lots of good information that people can then take within their own organizations. I think it's a gender and equity group at UC Berkeley has an equity fluent playbook, which I think is amazing for leaders, which is my focus now, which is leadership of responsible AI. So there's a lot of people working on that. A lot of people unpacking their data sets and trying to understand how their data annotation and data associations work. There are a lot of people who are directing responsible AI teams now to kind of do this work as well. But like I said, we are really at the mercy of these organizations to do the right thing in the absence of some sort of regulation. And not only just regulation, but where there is a little bit of regulation, the actual enforcement of said things.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. That was Jay Soglo, this question. Thank you for that question, Jay. Thank you, Elizabeth, for answering. Really quick, please, if you do have questions, put them into the Q&A field. And please do take advantage. We didn't really go into the bios of the people that are here, Jeff and Chhavi and Elizabeth, but take a look at their LinkedIn profiles. It's really an honor to have them here. They are tremendous thought leaders in this area. So please do take advantage. I do want to.
Randy, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Could I just say something about that last question, just to
please,
sort of
do, Jeff,
pick up on something? Yeah. because I think there's something we have to talk about here, around, yes, I mean, Elizabeth's exactly right. There are attempts being made to develop AI in more ethical ways. But one of the things that we have to talk about is who controls AI, right? And the reality is that most of the control of AI is with corporations. And I'm not trying to be anti-corporation. I'm just simply stating facts, right? That companies like Google and Facebook and Apple and others, in the U.S. and China are essentially where most of the AI is being developed. And in fact, we're seeing some of the recent data showing that there's a lot of migration of tenured faculty at universities migrating to companies because that's where the AI is available, or those academics are receiving more substantial funding from companies. And the point that I'm making is not to be sort of anti-corporate, is to simply say that there's a difference in agenda and difference in importance of how those things are being seen, especially if those who might train, computer scientists at the academy are moving to the corporation and doing things a little differently there. It's very expensive, right, to have AI, right? It's very expensive to have computing power to run AI, which is why corporations tend to dominate. And unfortunately, we have seen within the last 12 months how when companies are called to account with respect to their potential ethical breaches, they don't always react well, right? And Dr. Gebru was fired by Google for pointing out that there were ethical concerns, and then another person from that team was also fired, right? And so when companies are actually controlling the technology and then funding the ethical research, but then putting limits on it, we've seen the reports about how, again, I'm going to call out Facebook, how they've invited researchers in to look at the ethics of their technology, but then they don't want to release those results, or they prematurely cut off things that they think, or projects that they think are going to not be favorable for their reputation. So there are some real issues here in terms of how the technology is being developed, not just in terms of who's doing it, but also how the companies themselves are reacting when they're being questioned about the underlying ethical concerns.
Randy, I would like to add a comment there too. So yes, folks are trying to build AI using the ethical framework, but there are several ethical frameworks, and the developers or even the stakeholders involved in the process may not have the complete knowledge of something that they're building, or it might still have unforeseen, unintended consequences. So there are a bunch of companies that have now come up who are sort of akin to, how you did financial accounting. So what they're doing is they're providing mitigation tools, risk mitigation tools. So what they would do if someone has built an algorithm, they'll essentially run it through their systems, and they can tell what is the level of bias in the data sets they're using. So how's that affecting the outcomes? And they can tell you steps to mitigate that so you overcome that bias. They might be looking for fairness, how trustworthy is your AI? So essentially using the different frameworks on which you want to build ethical AI, there are companies who can provide you support to sort of conform your algorithm to make it more ethically viable and sustainable. And about the big tech, looking at algorithmic accountability themselves. But for example, how Google did, okay, we're going to put our own regulatory body to audit our content. No, you do not get to audit your own content. It has to be an external body who will audit your content, because it's unethical, it's not transparent, and we don't want to go that route. So there's a whole bunch of not-for-profit societies and organizations who are now pooling their resources to develop this auditing framework too, which can help audit the processes, the algorithmic or AI processes that big tech or any other company is building. So there could be red flags that could be raised, and then hopefully with the assistance of other companies who help with the mitigation of biased AI, we can have a very sustainable, scalable, interoperable AI.
And can I just add, I love those 2 points. I think that is so important. But as we're talking with publishers and we're talking with content, I came across something a couple of weeks ago. I think it's called Perspective AI API, which is a tool that I think some of the larger newspaper organizations like the Washington Post or the New York Times use. And this is kind of on that same subject to actually go through the language that you might be using in your publication to see if it's toxic. So there's like they're using AI behind it, but they're also helping you create content that's less toxic. So that's an opportunity, I think, that maybe we could think about as we move further into publishing, like what kinds of tools are out there to help us make sure that the language that we're using is appropriate, because we could spend a lot of time, I think, all of us who play in this space, talking about all of the things that are wrong, basically. And so, and there's a lot that's wrong, and this space is very crowded. And which is one of the reasons why I pivoted from the work in society to leadership, because that to me is where the influence is to direct, fair, and equitable technology. And so I do think we should spend some time or, you know, sharing with the folks here how they might be able to research what are some of the tools that could help them in their writing or publishing.
Great. There's another question in the chat. This is from one of the students, Christina Daniels. Are there any international organizations developing guidelines to WCAG that could influence regulation?
I don't know what is it?
WCAG?
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
All right.
Does anyone else know?
Maybe Christina could unpack that acronym in the question.
All right. Yeah, Christina, would you mind adding that in while that happens? I actually have another question for you all. And this is actually pivoting a little more focus on publishers. So Simon outlined in his presentation how AI is used by publishers to do metrics. We also see them developing the bestseller lists, you know, kind of contributing to those as well. So when considering the automation of a process, aside from the cost, of course, what questions should publishers be asking? Chhavi, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think this goes back to what I would suggest to anyone. First and foremost, questions should be whether or not an AI-based algorithm is needed or not, because oftentimes you have so much talent and you have folks with such great understanding of the process that you may not even need to use the AI to do something like that. And definitely focus on the primary goal, and to think about the benefactors and users. So when you're automating any process, you want to put the goals of the users front and center, make sure that their concerns are met. Also, I think it would be pivotal for any entity to know if the developers understand the process completely, because then they can sort of diminish the unforeseen, unintended consequences. And I'll go back to saying that again, that consulting all the stakeholders while they're developing a process would be critical.
And I'll add that I think that publishers should understand that getting into AI or understanding AI is a practice, right? You're not going to be able to take one class or watch a YouTube video and you're going to be an AI expert. And so it's a practice, and AI is influencing every aspect of our lives. And so I would say the question they should be asking is, how can I become a little bit more educated around the subject? And I would say having an open mind, having a creative mindset around the uses of AI. And then I would wonder if they would want to be a part of any groups that would help continue that learning experience. So building collaborative communities within your networks, or reaching out to folks as well. But also then asking, how might AI work for what I'm trying to do? How might it enhance or improve what I'm trying to do? But also taking it one step further, which we talked about before, which is ensuring that the tools that you're using, that maybe you can just do a quick check to see if there are AI ethics principles that are on the website. But first, just become familiar with it, get comfortable with it, ask the questions, use your curiosity to take you down a place so that it can become a practice. And I would just say, for me, that's just a very basic thing. And that's actually how I started in AI ethics. I just started asking questions. So I just want to share that perspective.
Yeah, and I would build on that to say that, if we're talking about a specific algorithm for a specific purpose, I kind of like the question that I've read that Kathy O'Neill is asking. She wrote Weapons of Math Destruction. And the question is, who does or who could this algorithm fail? Who will be failed by this algorithm? If you start from the standpoint of, and it goes back, I think it ties nicely into things both Elizabeth and Chhavi have said, but particularly this issue of unintended consequences, right? So you sort of start from the premise of, we want to apply an algorithm to do something that hopefully is good, like the ethical principle of beneficence, right? We want to do something good for human beings. But I think if we start from the question of who could this algorithm fail, who is this algorithm failing, we're also taking into consideration the sort of attached principle of non-maleficence, which is we don't want to do harm. So let's start from understanding who could be failed by the algorithm. And I think, to Elizabeth's point about really understanding, what the technologies you're using and how they think about principles, in a high stakes situation, which of course, scholarly publishing can be a very high stakes context for people, that you do want to ask those partners, what is their view of AI ethics? How do they integrate ethical considerations into their technologies and the development of those technologies, in the implementation of those technologies? What are they doing that ensures that to the greatest possible extent that their AI technologies, tools, and platforms are being developed and implemented and adopted in ethical ways? And if they don't have a perspective on that, then maybe you should think about working with someone else, because you really want to work with partners of all kinds who have a serious view on AI ethical considerations and are taking action in the way those technologies are being used.
Great. I'm going to jump around just a little bit on my line of questioning, because Chhavi, you had touched on this before about needing an AI ethics board, and most journals at least have editorial boards. So, and it sounds like there should be a human component that is a part of the process. So if organizations of all scale, right, the giant corporations and then those upstarts and the such, if this should be incorporated into our strategies, what kinds of skills or training should publishing companies be recruiting for to ensure alignment with successful AI and publishing strategies?
So, Randy, I would just say that I personally don't think you need an extra set of skills, right? Because we're talking about these ethical frameworks. The ethics remains the same. The application of the ethics varies based on the algorithm, and it could still be very different based on a particular process that you're using in the scholarly publishing landscape. So the basic principles remain the same, I would say, and each one of us has our own conscious and unconscious biases. So I would just say diversifying these AI ethics editorial board, there is a strong push to diversify the editorial boards right now. So I think that would be the key. You just need to have different lenses when people are looking at the same thing. You don't want a similar set of people, who are going to raise same red flags, but you need to have different perspectives to enable a new lens that was not considered while maybe developing that AI or deploying it, or, while training that AI. So I would just say similar set of principles, but multiple different lenses and a lot of different perspectives.
And I would add that I think sometimes when we think about adding diverse perspectives and values, that people think it's this, my God, that it's just too much, right? And so even if you can't bring in people as employees into your organization, there are certainly community organizations that you can tap into that can help expand your knowledge. But I also want to just pivot just a bit to say that any organization, whether it's a publishing organization or academia, They need to, in my opinion, adopt AI ethics training just like we go through cybersecurity training. And there needs to just be a very basic understanding and in the beginning to get people warmed up to this concept of the potential harms of AI and the systems, so that everyone in the organization can help be responsible to call something out if they see it. It should not just be one person or two people or the data scientists that are on the team. Even if you bring in those resources, everyone has an opportunity to be responsible for that. And so, and some of those questions that they should be asking are, well, what kind of data do I hold as a publisher? Like, this should be a part of the training. And how can I harness it safely? And what are those data sources? Are you getting your data from surveys? Are you getting them from stories? Where are you getting your data from? Stats? And so really just checking the sources, but also for me, at the very basic level, just have AI ethics training, just like you have cybersecurity training.
Yeah, I completely agree with Elizabeth's point. I think that, you know, editorial boards, like if we're going to have the same editorial review board for a journal dealing with ethics questions as Chhavi's suggesting, I think that's probably fine. Again, so long as that board has a measure of diversity, in which we certainly hope in 2021 that is the case. But I think training that board, training that group to have that experience. But I also think that there could be value for those boards to have an independent advisor who assists them, maybe not, you know, for the long term, but in the to get them into the right place and the right mindsets, so that whatever training is delivered, maybe it's by the same person, the training delivered, then that person can assist with the capacity building that needs to go, because needs to go along with it, because even though they're, you know, I think Chhavi's correct that the principles of ethics are going to apply in a very similar way. We want to be sure that the right questions are being asked. We want to make sure that there's opportunities to practice doing this kind of thing, because it'll be different. And so I think having some kind of independent advisor, and I think the independence of that person is very important, because then you are bringing someone who does not have an agenda attached to the publication, attached to the journal, who can assist in making sure that you're getting to the right conclusion about how the AI ethical considerations are being addressed in whatever context the journal is considering. So I think, you know, the things we've heard, plus maybe some other aspects like I've described, would be good for journal publishers to consider.
Great. So what I'm hearing is there's no need to know calculus for this, right? We're good. All right, we have just a few more minutes, and rather than me ask additional questions, I think I'd like to turn it over to each of you just to share anything that you want to make sure, and Simon, I invite you as well, share any thoughts that you may want the audience to take away from these sessions. And actually, Simon, since you had such a good break, I'll turn it over to you first. Anything you want to share with the audience that we haven't covered?
Thank you. I think the main thing is that there's going to be
there's a huge variety, a huge spectrum of understanding of what AI is, what it can do, and there's actually multiple spectrums, because there's a spectrum with regard to ethics, there's a spectrum with regard to the functionality. So it's a huge area. I made the same point in my notes here about I'm not aware kind of like has at the moment the bigger ones, and I think that's the minimum really requirement that I think we should have. And also the other point I was actually thinking about was going back to the question of asking with regard to ethics and AI. And I think one key question is how any time that AI is used, because that's the officer or manager who's representing that particular area within the organization has to be involved, because of the potential sense making AI. And I think if people are transparent, and if they're optimistic, like they're being properly transparent, and that they're involving the right internal state, then that's there's training involved. Then the platform to be forward for.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Simon. Chhavi.
Sure. So one thing that we have not talked about is digital education. So I'm a strong proponent of education and digital education. I feel like every individual in this era should be entitled and empowered to question, the technology that they're using. So you don't need to know math. Randy, I'm right there with you. Math is not my strongest virtue, but even then you can poke holes at, the algorithm, the AI-based technology to point out something that you notice that maybe the developers fail to notice, or maybe even after implementing, people are not talking about. So I think we should all focus on, in addition to having AI ethics officer, or like Jeff mentioned, an advisor. Elizabeth mentioned about having a community collaborative approach. So that is all is needed. But I would like to empower each and every individual with digital education so they understand at least the basics of what goes into the technology, start it early so the students understand, because I think they are far brighter than where I am right now. So, my daughter tells me about things that I don't even think about. Empower everyone with digital education, and everyone from the attendees, you have very unique perspective. If you see something, you see an AI not performing optimally, raise a flag, talk to folks who built it, talk to folks who are marketing it, and please enable everyone to prevent AI from making bad decisions before they go mainstream, and then we all go up against arms.
Thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what I've heard so far, and I think I remember hearing very early on in the pandemic from someone who said, we all have to be AI ethicists to some extent, even if we are not trained in that area. We have to learn ourselves, and there are so many excellent resources available, out there, and we've heard some of those ideas already shared here today. I would call out the work of the Algorithmic Justice League. Joy Boloamimi and others involved with that. And if you haven't watched Coded Bias, you absolutely must watch Coded Bias. It's an eye-opener, even for me, where all the stories were familiar to me. It was still an eye-opener to watch that. And I think it's really powerful. The other one that I would really recommend is the Montreal AI Ethics Institute. Has done excellent work. Stanford as well has done excellent work on this in terms of reporting about AI ethics and that sort of thing. So there are resources out there, no math required, that will help everyone be better at appreciating the complexity, but also the intensity of the issues associated with AI ethics and the real world considerations, the real harm to real human beings that you need to better understand. And you can think about it then in the context of your publication and your own work and your own life, really, because it goes beyond just our jobs and it goes into our lives as well.
Great, thank you. And final word, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I will say that we need all hands on deck, right? So it doesn't matter if you're a technologist or not a technologist. And in one of my roles as the Chief Culture and Ethics Officer for Women in AI, which is a nonprofit serving 8,000 women around the world, we're helping them respond to AI. So to me, we have to also incorporate different perspectives around the world. So what we might do here in the US might not be the same thing that can happen on the continent of Africa or even some countries or maybe in Mexico. And so what I love about being in that role is I get a chance to hear about all of the challenges around the world and how people are responding to them. And so I would love to see as many people that want to be influencers become influencers in the space of AI ethics, because we certainly need more help. And you do not have to be a ones and zeros person. I'm not I'm not a data scientist, but 4 years ago, to Jeff's point, I watched the video AI Ain't I a Woman by Joy Bulamwini, and that is how I got my start into AI ethics. I had been doing, leadership of other technology initiatives. And I started with just basic questions like, is this possible? And can you show me how? And why not? And just different questions. And so I'll just leave with that to say all hands on deck. Feel free to join the community because AI isn't going anywhere.
Absolutely.
Thank you all. Hey, Pooja.
I just wanted to offer gratitude for all of our human intelligence shared in this panel and all of the wonderful complexities around using artificial intelligence to both improve and enhance our publishing communities and our scholarly output, and also some of the pitfalls of that. So thank you all for such a rich conversation. We're going to wrap up this session, but there is another session happening, I think almost concurrently. So please stay tuned and continue joining us for the conference. Thanks so much today, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you all.